Welcome to the Illustrator Studio. I am Jesse Kowalski, curator of exhibitions at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The Illustrator Studio is a weekly interview series, a project of the museum's Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies. In this episode of the Illustrator Studio, we welcome Donato Giancola. Considered a rock star in the world of fantasy art, in 2004, Giancola was named Best Artist at the World Fantasy Awards and Best Artist at the Hugo Awards in 2006, 2007, and 2009. He paints in a classical style that isn't comparable to many contemporary artists. I would compare Giancola's work to that of Rembrandt or Peter Paul Rubens. His admiration for the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien is made apparent in the numerous paintings he has created depicting the Lord of the Rings saga. He's compiled many of these works in the books Middle-earth: Visions of a Modern Myth and Middle-earth: Journeys in Myth and Legend, which feature more than 200 artworks. Donato, welcome.
All right. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Norman Rockwell Museum.
Yeah, so you were one of the very first artists I contacted when I was planning the exhibition, because you're one of the greats.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm just one of the people working out there now.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's for an exhibition this summer. It opens June 12th.
Yeah.
Enchanted: A History of Fantasy Illustration. And your painting, St. George and the Dragon, is actually on the cover of the book.
Right.
So I guess, how does it feel to see your work play such a central role in an art exhibition?
Well, I'm very honored, very much so, and actually also feel very lucky because you curated the show and you know how many great works of art are in this thing, and it's just every time I get into a show, I feel lucky to be included amongst my peers and hear a historical retrospective. So I don't know what was going through your minds, the publisher's minds, when you had to juggle what image to put on, but very grateful and lucky to be on there on that cover representing the show.
Yeah, no, the exhibit, so it covers, the book covers 5,000 years of,
Right. Yeah.
fantasy, and in the exhibit we have works back to the 1500s or so. So it covers, fantasy illustration through a number of periods.
Right.
St. George and the Dragon, of course, is just one of many archetypal images of a man battling the beast. That goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and
Right.
3500 BC. And your painting is it's so perfectly composed, such a gorgeous painting. What was your inspiration for painting that one?
Wow, I mean, St. George, like you said, it's got deep mythological, historical roots. And I can, immediately as soon as we start talking about St. George and the Dragon, for me, the iconic image of Raphael's at a miniature painting, I don't know if you've seen it down at the National Gallery. It is of a little St. George and the Dragon. And, I think it's maybe 8 or 9 inches tall.
Mhm.
It's like a manuscript page, but that image just keeps coming back to my mind of kind of humanity against nature, primal forces at play, and also the idea of a kind of a compassionate act, that it's St. George rescuing somebody, in service to someone else's needs. So I think that really plays into this wonderful idea of narrative, and why I think that's why we have fantasy art now. The birth of it, the growth of it, and the explosion of it is telling stories and connecting people together over stories.
Well, hey, so connecting people and telling stories. Let's move on to your childhood. So I wasn't allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid.
No.
Because of the stigma. And it was awful. But
you know what? I remember that there was a wave. My parents were like devil worshipping, right? Because they had
right,
satanic images and things, and
kids in their basement with the candles. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So go ahead.
No, but I know that you played it growing up. And what effect did it have on your creative development?
None at all. No. I know it was like probably one of the most instrumental engagements in my childhood. Even now, like the repercussions of that. So for Dungeons and Dragons, those who probably heard of it, but you basically make up your own story. You have somebody who's guiding you like a writer through a story of what these other characters, the other friends play through. And I think that for me is what I love so much about it. Was here's a chance for me to make my own stories, make my own world building, like making Dungeons and Dragons maps. I mean, that's actually where I first kind of stepped deep into creativity, was distancing myself from the modules that they would have available for most players. And I just made everything myself. I built the world, I drew the maps, populated them, and ran the campaigns as a dungeon master for my friends. So that foundation, Jesse, I think laid the foundation for me for the creativity that I then tapped into as a professional. The idea that I'm a world builder. I rely on some input from like writers and external sources, but really the internal storytelling gets motivated from within. And that again dates right back to Dungeons and Dragons.
And could you tell us a little bit about your art education?
Oh boy. That's a long, twisty path. Like I think, like you, right? We all draw when we're kids, right? So I mean, everybody draws. It's a way of, it's like you almost learn to draw before you could almost speak, right? The idea of like image making, mark making, and all that. So as a young man, a young child, I just drew all the time. I was prolific, just outputting, but I didn't have my first official class with it, like an art teacher, until I was 20 years old. So
Wow.
I didn't start, yeah. So like most of my work, all of my Dungeons and Dragons things, those were all as a hobbyist, as a fan, as just a creative person looking for outlet. Uh, and it was, so yeah, 20 years, at the age of 20, I picked up my first set of acrylics, tried painting, realized I needed some help immediately, and I took my first drawing class at the University of Vermont,
Oh, that's
and
great.
that slowly set me on my path towards becoming a professional.
And so, what were your first jobs as a professional?
Oh wow! Well, my first job started soon after that very first class. Is I would I worked retail selling electronics,
Oh, yeah.
and on a chalkboard we would there's a chalkboard in our workplace, and we used to rent out videos, and I would draw the new rentals that came in, like ET or like Empire Strikes Back, and I draw a little bit of that. And one of the people who came in to rent videos was a local restaurant owner. He saw the artwork, asked if I did anything else. I showed him a few of my new images from my new drawing class, and he hired me to populate his restaurant with images from like the 1940s and 50s, like Laurel and Hardy and
Oh,
Billie
wow.
Holiday and
Mhm.
Citizen Kane. So I did reproductions of these people for his restaurant.
That's great.
Yeah, so it was actually my first, my first drawing class ended up getting me my first professional work. Like,
Do
how
those still
lucky you get.
exist? Do those still exist?
Yes, unfortunately the restaurant burned down,
Mhm.
but they were somebody found some of those drawings out at a marketplace, like on sale, and so yeah, I verified that those were indeed my
Oh, that's great.
originals. Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned before the impact of art museums on your life. Besides the Norman Rockwell Museum, of course,
Right.
what museums do you visit for inspiration, and what draws you to visit art museums?
Wow, it's like almost more like the question should be, what museums don't I visit? Because I'm a hound. Like the Norman Rockwell Museum focuses on narrative realism and contemporary illustration as well. But I think what I love about museums is the act of discovery, of stepping into these places and discovering something new, a new way to tell the same old stories.
Mhm.
And that's what I love about the experience of both getting ideas, technical ideas, storytelling ideas from those artists from deep in the past. And museums also represent a curated aspect of that work, is that you're getting some of the best of the pieces of history, of art history, of narrative history, of storytelling and art making. So you walk into a museum, for me, it's like walking into like a curated show, like what you guys do at the Norman Rockwell Museum. You're attempting to present to the general public these valuable voices and the most critical aspects of those voices to present to an audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why I love going to museums, is that it's inspiring, and it's again that act of wonderful discovery.
And who are some of your favorite artists and your favorite pieces that you like to look at?
Oh, for museums, wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot. Ah, boy. Here's some example. Like even though this isn't the end all be all of lists, but
Mm-hmm.
back in like 15 years ago, there was a Caravaggio painting that came from Ireland to the States. It was The Taking of Christ by Caravaggio. And I made a pilgrimage up to Boston to see that painting, just that one painting. So, I realized that it's never going to be in the States again. It'll be forever hung in the National Museum in Ireland, never to leave as a national treasure. So I drove up and met my brother in Boston, and we went for the afternoon to go look at this one painting. At least I did. I don't know what he did. He was like, I think he wandered around a little bit while I took in that painting.
Yeah.
But that's an example. Like so, Caravaggio, Hieronymus Bosch, and the great classics, Raphael, but also some contemporary artists. Certainly, the Dungeons and Dragons illustrators. From like Keith Parkinson and Jeff Easley, Larry Elmore. I mean, some of these people I think are included in your show
Sure.
as well, right? And so to be honest, I tap into a deep and wide pool of inspiration, Jesse, because I just find validation in so many different people, so many different art forms, and then I spit it out into my own work.
Yeah, since you mentioned it, we'll have the very first painting done for the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons set by David Sutherland.
Yeah, David Sutherland. I mean, those images are iconic. Like those are forever burned in my mind. I think Sutherland might have also done The Night in Hell, where he's fighting demons, and that's another brilliant piece in the Player's Handbook. That's burned into my head as the stereotypical passionate knight in armor.
And what is it about fantasy that interests you?
And fantasy art for me is using your imagination and combining that with storytelling, narrative storytelling. And so science fiction for me is just the same. It's just using futuristic themes and extrapolated sciences and such. So fantasy art, well, I guess in some ways it's about revisiting what makes us human. Like revisiting like those stories, the reconnecting to why we make our choices, what we do, how we interact with each other. And art is a wonderful way to kind of revisit these themes and redigest the reoccurring nature of what makes us human. So I think the greatest part of fantasy is that you're using your imagination, so you're just constantly in a flux of possibility as a creator, as an artist.
Yeah. And what draws you to J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings?
Oh wow! It has deep roots, like Dungeons and Dragons does. It's like that taps back into our childhood. My brother Michael handed me the Hobbit when I was 13. He said, "Here, you might like this book." This is just as I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. And those are like made for each other, right? I mean, Dungeons and Dragons was inspired by Tolkien, so it was obvious that The Hobbit which then led me into the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Book of Lost Tales and Unfinished Tales. And all right, so like I just dove in, like I just this rabbit warren, and I just forever am digging around in there. So I can't really say what more than that. It's adventure, right? It is the idea of conflict and resolution, but also I think friendship, like it's camaraderie, right? It's about people coming together, helping each other. So I think that's what I love most about the novels of what Tolkien did, is that the way you solve problems isn't like warfare doesn't always solve it, right? It's like the way they destroy the One Ring. It's two friends who sneak their way in, and it's friendship and love of each other that saves the day, not the big armies that are attacking Mordor or fighting it out in the battlefield.
For you, what do you find is the most difficult part of creating a painting? Is it do you get like a writer's block, or is it a matter of coming up with ideas?
I think ideas. I've never had issue with writer's block. I've never experienced that, so I've been lucky that. Again, I think it ties into like I mentioned, like I was a fan and a hobbyist for most of my part of my life as I drew. So my art was just a free flow way of communicating, of thinking. So I never created impediments to that language, right? If I worried about my grammar, right? Some people would never write because they misspell things, they wouldn't get punctuation right. And so it was art and drawing was always free flow of ideas. And so as a professional, again, that just taps in, like I just never am without themes and ideas. I have a little bit of a wall over here of little thumbnails. So I've got like about 100 thumbnails of ideas that I'd love to do.
Wow.
And those are like I'm ready, like any moment, like if I have free time, I'm like jumping on those things.
And what's your process for creating works? Because Rockwell like to use photographic reference.
Right.
Do you use any reference photographic or models? And what's your process for creating a painting?
100%. Like I mean, Rockwell and those illustrators of the golden age are like they helped. Well, they laid a very strong foundation in photographic referencing, and in part that spoke not so much that they didn't like working from life, but the timeliness, the deadlines that they had to execute required that you couldn't have a model pose for weeks on end, right? You had to get the image together, assemble it, and actually Rockwell, like, very good at taking like action, right? Getting people to pose and like elaborating the action and embellishing the figure. So all of those are all techniques that I use now. The idea of, I mean, everything that is inside my picture, like the St. George and the Dragon as an example, that image, that armor is an assemblage of knights from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The woman, or I guess you could see it's a woman. Actually, you don't even know the gender of these characters, but there's the woman lying down, the maiden, is my daughter Cecilia. But the dragon, I had to make up the dragon. I don't have a dragon lying around. So, but the wings, the dragon's wings, I still remember that they're from the American Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. So the Museum of Natural History, not the American, I think that's the National Museum of Natural History, is down in Washington, D.C. is a bat, I think as a fruit bat there. And that's the wings. If you go there, you can see, right, this dragon and that bat and the images that were inspired by that.
Do you paint at a certain size, or does the size of the painting kind of depend on the theme or subject?
I mean, as an illustrator, I do have certain sizes that I
know you paint some very large, right?
Yeah, like that's just going crazy. But it is there is a bit of whimsy, not whimsy, but like if I love an idea passionately, then I break away from my needs to execute it for just as a like an illustration for a client for a book cover, and then I'll make it larger, add more detail to it. Sometimes even embellish the structure, the surroundings a little bit more. But I have created very large canvases when I've been inspired by the Hudson River School painters like Albert Bierstadt and Frederick Church. And those are fantasy related, but they are on a much more monumental scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it really, I think, almost all artists tend to work like according to, their options, right? Mostly they're, like Rockwell was constrained by commercial commissions. But again, later in life, he started making larger pieces, right? So that's just the opportunity allowed him to spend more labor. And so therefore he did, he exercised that ability.
All right, so let's get serious here for a minute.
Okay, all right.
So your work is often compared to that of the old masters, but throughout the 20th century, and often still today, art critics have kind of drawn a line between illustration and fine art. And do you consider, I guess, what do you consider the line, and do you consider yourself an illustrator or a fine artist?
Oh, I guess I'm mostly, if you had to, like when I'm filling out my tax forms, I'm calling myself an illustrator. But those, again, these are titles that I think other people put on artists. So I think of myself more as just a painter, an artist. Certainly most of my clients have been commercial related, commercial illustration, book covers, game cards, advertising and things. So yeah, in that sense of categorizing, I'm an illustrator. But I also came up through in the 90s when everyone was doing traditional media, but digital was switching over. And so back in 15 years ago, when huge waves of artists were switching to digital, I stayed as a painter because I still like making that physical object, which is what you show at the museum, right? As tangible objects, the physical presence of those artist choices, those artist touches, the hand manipulating that material.
And how are illustrators taught, I guess, when you were going to school? Because I know when I was in college in art history, it kind of went from the Impressionists to abstract expressionism. We just skipped over the Rockwell and the illustrators. Did you have that same kind of experience?
I got skipped over for all. I was actually, you're talking about fine art. My training, Jesse, was in fine art painting at Syracuse University. So here, I didn't really discover illustrators in the terms of like a classical sense until I almost left college. Like finding out about like Michael Whalen. Obviously there's illustrators I was exposed to with Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy and comic book art, which is what I grew up with. But like Waterhouse, it took me years even after school to discover John Waterhouse's work. And so that like the blinders that you put on when you study a certain class is like can be a negative. I love figurative work. I love storytelling. I love realism, but I wasn't exposed to that much of it in the illustrator's history. Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, Harvey Dunn, Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker, right? All these names that I now roll off my tongue all came after my college experience.
Wow.
Yeah. It's amazing, but again, that doesn't mean that like you have to be forced into that, right? To learn and to celebrate it, right? So here I am now as a professional, living in that almost direct lineage of those illustrators, right? But I didn't actually grow up with that.
That's funny.
Right? It's like I think you fall into it regardless of where you're coming from, right? Because it is the common ground. It's a common historical ground that you end up seeking out if you're a storyteller.
All right. Yeah. In October 2019, I was lucky enough to sit through one of your sessions where you were doing some drawing for students. And
Uh,
like everyone else, I was just enamored with your technique and delivery and just the excitement you had. And I wondered, do you teach often, or do you find joy in teaching others?
yeah, I actually I've been teaching, boy, almost since I left college, and since 95 was my first class that I taught. So
Wow.
2 years after being out of college, uh, I wasn't a good teacher then. I say I'm much better now. But I know, like when you saw me, like that was a few years ago. So I've been teaching then by almost 20 years. So yeah, I love teaching. I am currently hosting online classes, mentoring other professionals that are out there,
Mhm.
and I plan to continue teaching because seriously, I could not be where I am today without those other professionals that took the time to show their skills, open up the doors, show ways of thinking where I am to, their ideas and share those with students.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's why museums, for me, are very important as well.
And throughout your career, what's the most important piece of advice you could offer a struggling art student?
Wow, be prolific. Just don't stop. Make art. Be passionate about it. Make art around things you like. Tell stories about things you like, and eventually you'll either find your place where you can make that work as a career, or other people will see what you do and bring what you do into what they want to do, and merge those two together.
Mhm.
So I think it's just don't stop. Uh, don't be hindered by technical problem. Like I said, like I couldn't draw people very well. Like kind of faked it, and I still fake it even now, even as a, right. So it's you just like if you just don't feel impeded, just do it. Just do it. Just feel, embrace the clumsiness. I think that's it. And just like don't don't feel the pressures of other people's expectations.
Looking back, what artworks that you've created are you most proud of?
I'll I There's quite a few that that would sit up there. Mostly I think the pieces for me that resonate deep are those that speak to that idea of storytelling, but also of compassion between characters. So there's a graphic novel cover to The Hobbit that I created about 20 years ago. And like I mentioned to you, like it's the Tolkien does. It's not about the battles and the big conflict. So what I chose for that cover was Gandalf and Bilbo and the hobbits as they're all kind of huddled together, working their way through the misty mountains during the rainstorm, with the stone giants off in the distance.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a very climactic. It's not even a climactic moment. It's just
Mhm.
the drudgery of like trying to survive. It's raining. It's horrible. It's nasty, and and but it's human, right? That's like everyone knows that experience of getting caught in a rainstorm, right? I'm sure you, right? You've
Yeah.
had that, like, and it so that I wanted to have you empathize with Bilbo, what it felt like to go out into the big world and see new things. So
And,
that's one of them. That's so yeah,
right.
that's the ideas.
Yeah, and so you've been in a number of exhibits. You've got, you won countless awards,
Thank you.
accolades from your peers. When I was at LuxCon, you were just swarmed by, students and artists, and
Mm.
yet you're just so humble. You were kind of taking time with each person, giving them a piece of your time. So, what keeps you that way? What makes you humble after winning so many awards?
Well, I'm not in it for the awards. I mean, the awards are very nice, they're gracious, and I appreciate them. But the reason why I make my art is not to win an award. The awards come from people's judgment outside, external judgment of what I'm doing. And again, it goes back to that, like I mentioned about teaching, like the idea of someone gave up their own passion to spend time in the studio to share, like a teacher, like to share their ideas, to take time out to slowly explain things. And I feel like I have a responsibility to give that back and pass that on to another generation of artists and illustrators, storytellers who want to do the same with their own ideas, with their visions. So I think what I'm very much aware of is that I am just one in a lineage of storytellers. Like I am here today because of the storytellers like Rockwell, like storytellers like J.R. Tolkien, right, who shared their passion and passed along their knowledge. And so I'm hoping that somebody after me, some student that maybe, or some other artist that, that gets influenced by walking into the Norman Rockwell, like seeing the show Enchanted, right? Might be a future illustrator, a future storyteller, right? And that's all I need to be happy with. That's my part.
Well, that's all the time we have, Donato. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Yes.
For more information, check out donatoarts.com and our own websites, nrm.org, illustrationhistory.org, and visit the Rockwell Center for American Studies at rockwell-center.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to be notified of the latest content, and this has been a production of the Norman Rockwell Museum. To watch the video of this podcast or to see the images referenced in this episode, please visit nrm.org/podcast. New episodes from the Illustrator Studio are released every Monday. For questions or comments, please email us at podcast@nrm.org.